I think what a lot of people see across the world or they see in the news is not necessarily the realities of the U.S.-Mexico border. That's partially the reality.
Olá pessoal, eu sou o professor Ronei Teodoro da Silva e estamos aqui com mais um UCS Play Podcast, o programa com gente que entende do assunto. Lembrando que vocês podem assistir esse podcast em nosso canal do YouTube ou escutar o áudio no Spotify. Para quem está assistindo no YouTube, você pode conferir os tópicos que nós vamos discutir hoje ali na descrição do vídeo, onde nós dividimos, cada assunto por um timecode diferente. Você pode clicar ou, se preferir, pode assistir o episódio inteiro. Hoje, no programa, nós temos um convidado muito especial. Trata-se do Dr. John Klingemann.
Klingemann.
Ok, got it right. É o pró-reitor da Faculdade de Artes e Humanidades lá no Texas. Ele esteve aqui na UCS dando uma palestra intitulada Fronteira Estados Unidos, México, Segurança de Fronteira. O Dr. Klingemann é especializado em História Latino-Americana, México Moderno e a fronteira dos Estados Unidos com o México. So, hello, Dr. Klingemann, right?
Yes, sir, okay. That's correct. Dr. Klingemann, yeah. How about John? Just go with John.
Okay, John.
Let's make it informal.
Yeah, that's easier.
I like it.
We always like to start here by letting the guest talk a little bit about himself. Or maybe you can talk a little bit what brings you to our university.
If you want me to talk about myself, I'm a historian, so I can keep talking forever.
Yeah.
Right? But I'll cut it down short. So,
okay.
My name is John Eusebio, I guess Eusebio, right?
Mm-hmm.
Klingemann. And I'm originally from West Texas. I was born in West Texas in a very small town of less than 100 people.
Wow.
Agricultural town, and right on the border. And so, I grew up in West Texas, attended a local university, and then left the state of Texas, went to Arizona, my doctorate, Executive Leadership Academy. And so, I've been at this university, at Angelo State University now for about 15 years. Okay. So this is my 25th year in academia. I worked as a staff member for 10 years at a small university in West Texas, Sol Ross State University. And now I'm the pró-reitor of the College of Arts and Humanities at Angelo State University. And so the question is, what brought me here? And that's an easy question to answer, because I approached one of our professors, Dr. Fagner Magrinelli Rocha, who is actually from Caxias do Sul. As a student of Latin American history at the University of Arizona, I came in contact with a lot of students from Brazil. Indeed, I had to enroll in a class on Brazilian history. And so I really became enamored with Brazilian history. I'm a fan of Brazilian history. So we have a growing study abroad program, and I spoke with Dr. Rocha and asked him to look into establishing a study abroad program for our students at Angelo State University. Mm-hmm. And he told me, I'm originally from Caxias do Sul, so I will reach out to them. I have a lot of friends and people there that I talk to. And so, lo and behold, it became a reality. And so I spoke to him and said, I will visit to see how the program is going. And let me tell you, it has been a magnificent surprise.
Really?
Landed in Porto Alegre at 12:30, and so the 2-hour drive from Porto Alegre to Caxias do Sul was magnificent, even though it was at night, driving through the mountains. And so now that I've toured the city, this is a wonderful place. This is a magnificent place, Caxias do Sul. I've become a fan of Juventude now. We visited their stadium. I've seen some of it. And absolutely beautiful city. And so I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of it.
Well, here, the region, it's a very different way that was colonized if you compare the rest of Brazil, because it was late colonized. It was like one of the last places where the Europeans came. And the mindset was to come here and stay here. So I think by the time Europe was a little bit overpopulated, and they didn't have enough land for everybody in a time where you just have to have land to survive.
Sure.
And so in this region particularly, was the Italians that came, and they came after, so they got like the worst place between the hills. I cannot imagine how it was climb all these hills and to establish city here and around here.
Cleared the trees.
Yeah. I have no, because we are in the south of Brazil. We are not in the Amazon, but it's kind of very rough jungle. It's not a jungle, but it's not a forest like you guys have in the United States, where it's a little bit more open. It's heavy
vegetation
where you cannot enter. I have no idea how they got here. And before that, we had German in the more not the better place, but or best, but was easier to get access close to the rivers.
Sure.
So the Germans got first, and they got all this region,
Right.
and then the Italians were sent here. And I guess that it's a good segue for maybe our next topic. When you came here basically to talk about immigration, right?
Well, that was one of the topics that
Okay.
I talked about. But to your point, the immigration to the United States in the late 1800s, there's a major surge in immigration to the United States that included German peoples, that included Italians.
Around the same.
It was around the
time.
same time. So this is a similar process that you see develop in the United States. And as a matter of fact, because I'm the descendant of German immigrants, but my family came to Texas in the 1820s, 1830s. And so as it turns out, I'm actually a seventh generation Texan, and they were Germans who ended up in Texas, and they were carpenters and farmers. And so it was a very similar process, maybe a little bit earlier in Texas, but then by the late 1800s, you see the same type of immigration to the United States. I ended up speaking to the students about here at the university at UCS. I talked about the U.S.-Mexico border because, part of my training during my doctoral program revolved around the United States-Mexico border. My dissertation topic was actually on Mexico's Revolution of 1910, and that came from the fact that my own grandfather fought in Mexico's Revolution of 1910, and then later he became a part of the post-revolutionary military in Mexico, and then retired from the military in 1955. So he was a veteran of Mexico's Revolution, and if anybody who studies Mexico's Revolution understands that it was a major watershed moment in Mexican history. It gave rise to so many, the post-revolutionary government, Mexico's Constitution of 1917. But going back to the whole border, that's an interesting topic because I think what a lot of people see across the world or they see in the news is not necessarily the realities of the U.S.-Mexico border. That's partially the reality, but there are a lot of us that grew up on the border that are hardworking citizens and contributors to our nation. So it was a great topic.
It's also is a very difficult topic to discuss because there is, especially now here in Brazil also, it's very polarized. People can think that if you have one position, you think all of this, or if you have a different position, you have all of this, but the truth is between, right? The only information that got to Brazil, I think we get the most controversial part of the information about this frontier. It's the kids in cage and the wall, of course.
Sure.
Wall. That was the two main topics about the problem in the U.S. and Mexico border.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people see worldwide, right? Those are the images that people see worldwide. But there's the U.S.-Mexico border. I mean, it's a 2,000-mile long border.
Okay.
Because as a historian, I don't necessarily jump too much into current events. Because, as a historian, I look at the history of the region. And so what I explain to the students is that if you understand the history of the region, then you understand the context of what's taking place today along the U.S.-Mexico border. And I spoke about, colonialism because, this was, it changed the lives of the indigenous people forever. Spanish colonists, English colonists, French colonists. I mean, they changed forever the lives of Indians. And there's not a lot of history that's left behind of the indigenous people in, let's say, West Texas, where I grew up, because there's very little written information.
Yes.
And what you tend to find are archaeological sites that have the remnants of, small groups of Indians that lived in those regions, or maybe the paintings on cave walls or on the walls of canyons where people left, memories, some of them as simple as a hand design up on the wall, or some of them as intricate as the portrayal of wildlife in the area. And then, of course, you find the stone tools and you find ceramics. But what I talked about is that with the introduction of colonial systems, that's where you see borders that are established between the Spanish, the French, the English. And with the independence of the English colonies from England, then you have the construction of the Articles of Confederation, a first attempt at a government in what is today the United States, and then, of course, subsequently the United States of America. And from there, you have a westerly expanding United States. You have the purchase of Louisiana that belonged to the French, actually belonged to the Spanish at one point and then the French. And so now you have a system of westward expanding United States under manifest destiny that, is a threat to the Spanish. Mexico gains its independence in 1821, and it is a vast territory that Mexico has as a nation that expands all the way from California to what is today Texas and all the way down to Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, and even beyond. So, the revolution in Texas in 1836 takes place, and then the United States-Mexico War of 1846 and 1848, and it ends in 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that pretty much formed what is today the United States-Mexico border between both nations. And Mexico lost over half of its national territory in that war. And so that pretty much, with the exception of the Gadsden Purchase in 1853.
Oh, yeah, I thought it was bought.
Was purchased
in
1853. And then the Chamizal affair between Juarez and El Paso. But 1848 pretty much is what established the U.S.-Mexico border. And so, once you have that international boundary, it went right through the middle of some communities. And so when I talk about the U.S.-Mexico border, I tend to talk about it from two perspectives. The academic perspective, because I am an academic, right? Well, I'm on the dark side now. I'm an administrator, right? And then also the insider's perspective, because I grew up on the U.S.-Mexico border. And there's a lot of great people on the U.S.-Mexico border. The people who live a daily life, and they're in, that are productive, contributing citizens, and we love the area where we grow up. So, big question is culturally, where does the border end and begin, right? Is it 50 miles inland, 75 miles inland? And what makes you a borderlander, right? So if I was to ask you, how would you describe someone from Caxias do Sul? What would you say?
Well, I'm not from here. So I'm from the German part of our state. But it's really hard to say. They like to say they are immigrants and the spring of the Italians. They are from but you can find like in the rest of Brazil. In the south of Brazil, you can say in a way there's probably more really descent of direct from Europeans. A lot of people can get like 2 passports here because of that. Right. My father actually is from São Paulo, so I know both sides. And the north of Brazil, middle of Brazil and north, it's really hard to pinpoint where you're from or your orange, because it's a lot of miscegenation. And there is Brazil, and that part I think it's similar, but also different from the United States, because we had the Portuguese, when they came here, they never intend to establish a country. They always want this to be a territory where they can get the resource back to Europe. And it was interesting that when the Napoleon Bonaparte war, when they invaded Portugal, the king of Portugal left. He just said, "Okay, you guys." Yeah, it was very funny because he didn't even try to fight. He just went to his ship and left and said to the Portuguese people, "Okay, the French are coming, and the instructions for you guys is to surrender. Right. I'm going to Brazil." Right. So when he arrived here, he started to establish a country in 1808. Mm-hmm. So that's when Brazil started to develop, to become what we can see Brazil it is now, with a bank and with a university, and now we start in Rio de Janeiro. But before that, people that were here are either Portuguese that have land here, Indians. I cannot imagine how the region, what the time was like. back then because the
Very
travel,
difficult,
I think,
I'm sure.
yeah, it was impossible. So the Portuguese, they were here, but they never want to be here. They got the land, but they got the money sending all the goods to Portugal. So when the Portuguese king came, that's when we kind of start to get an identity. So yeah, here from to give you trying to give a long answer short. It's
maybe you're a historian too, right?
Yeah, it's impossible. I am a professor, so too. We are used to talk 3-4 hours.
Oh,
so
of course.
Ask one question, and
that's a good
that's
thing.
enough. Yeah,
that's a good thing.
Yeah, I hope so. So people here, they still have this identity with Italy, and in this more south of this region with German.
Okay.
So they like to, they have like a pride that, okay, we are part Brazilian and part German, we are part Brazilian and part Italian. I don't know if that's the actual true. I don't know when somebody came from these countries here that they actually say, oh, yeah, here's similar to Italy or similar to Germany. In fact, my sister is married with a German guy. She lives in Germany.
And she lives in Germany.
And when they came here, it's strange because people, especially in the south of the state, people say, oh, so you are German, you probably feel at home. And said, no, it doesn't look like German at all. So yeah, there's one thing, how people see themselves here.
Sure.
And I would say, especially in this region, they see like they are extent of Italy.
So I think there's a lot of similarities of what we have along the U.S.-Mexico border. And I can use Texas as an example, right?
Okay.
So I'm a seventh-generation Texan on my father's side, but my mother's from Mexico. And so, it's different, I believe, for Mexican immigrants because immigration from Mexico, if you look at when Porfirio Diaz seized power in Mexico in 1876, he modernized the country, but by 1900, 80% of the people were impoverished. And so, there were people that immigrated to northern Mexico and then into the United States as early as, in the 1800s, 1900s, and they established a culture, but really they reinforced a culture that already existed there because those territories belonged to Spain and then later Mexico. Mm-hmm. So in Texas, we don't have families that are overseas, they're next door. And so I believe that's something to take into consideration whenever we're talking about identity, because we never become detached from that Mexican identity because it's right next door.
Okay.
And if you look at the state of Texas, I can give you some numbers today in the state of Texas, and it may be similar to other states along the U.S.-Mexico border, but in Texas, roughly 52% of the population are Hispanic, which are, overwhelmingly Mexican-American, 95, 97%, maybe even more than that. By 2023, 60% of graduates from Texas high schools are going to be Hispanic. Okay. So the state is what we call now in the United States a minority-majority state. And, so if you go to the state of Texas, then you see this vibrant Texan culture that has a lot of characteristics rooted in Mexican culture. And there's a large Hispanic population that lives in there. They're part of, we are all part of the system. We're professors, politicians, you name it. So, but I see some similarities between Texas and Caxias do Sul, where you have this immigrant experience. A little different in the sense that, people of Mexican origin were already there. Mm-hmm. And then with the War of 1846, 1848, then there was an international boundary that was established. Mm-hmm. But even then, it's different in the sense that there's a vibrant culture along the U.S.-Mexico border that's a borderlanders culture. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is a little bit different because, it brings up questions about the limitations of the nation state. And then also the sister cities that are part of the U.S.-Mexico border, Juarez and El Paso. And those sister cities have become economically intertwined. They provide an incredible amount of money for each other. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that people in Juarez go shopping in El Paso. People in El Paso go shopping in Juarez, right? Mm-hmm. And so, if anything, what I would like to tell people is to look beyond what you see in the news and understand the nuances of those of us that live along the U.S.-Mexico border that contribute to our nation, that contribute to the construction of culture along the border.
It's similar here with cities that are close to the border, but of course we don't have the same tension that probably you guys have. I'm guessing you have from what we get from the news, because for a long time here in South America, there is this whole cooperation between countries, and it's really easy to cross any border here with just, you don't even need a passport, you just, with your national ID, you can cross and you can shop. And there are a lot of cities that they are literally divided in the middle, the Brazilian side and the Argentina side, the Uruguay side. And, it's just a street. People can cross the street and in the other country. And, when I went to the United States, it's a whole different thing that I saw in the border. And that's, I think, it's what it's different for us, how the relation and the tension between the border.
When I spoke to the students, I said, as a historian, then I can tell you that there are periods that, if you look at what happened, what took place, that it pretty much established, it's the origins of where United States policies come from today. For instance, the period of Mexico's Revolution of 1910, the combative phase from 1910 to 1920, certainly changed the dynamics of the U.S.-Mexico border, because there was conflict that took place along the border, and the United States reacted by sending military personnel to the border. In Texas, two of the biggest military bases, Fort Hood and Fort Bliss. Well, Fort Bliss is right there on the border. There was also agents that were sent down to the border in reaction to the hostilities, the conflict that was taking place in Mexico. The Bureau of Investigation, which later became the FBI, sent agents down into Mexico. And so that in itself, it gives you an idea on, certain aspects revolving around U.S. policy towards the border, the militarization of the border, an increase in personnel that operate along the border. And so that in itself, I believe, was one of those watershed moments that certainly contributed to the construction of a thought process and policy towards the U.S.-Mexico border that only was reinforced throughout the course of the 20th and 21st centuries.
Yes, and I imagine also United States have just basically two borders, right? One with Mexico and another one with Canada.
Well, okay, that's a great question, because I always ask my students in class, well, how many borders are in the United States? And they say two, Canada and the one with Mexico. And I said, really? What about the western seaboard and the eastern seaboard?
Okay.
And then what about the border that extends from Florida down into Texas and the Gulf of Mexico?
Yes.
So what is our concept of borders?
Yeah, just when it's our land, but it's not
it's
just
not.
that.
How do we perceive borders? And that's something that, as a person that grew up along the U.S.-Mexico border, I never saw the border as a dividing line. Never. Because there were too many people, too many family members that lived directly in Mexico. So I never saw it as a dividing line. And that's, I think, an important facet that really is part of the culture that revolves, the identity that revolves around the border, borderlanders, fronterizos. And it is different, and so I want, how is the border between here and Uruguay and Paraguay?
Yeah, Brazil basically bordered every country in South America except two. I think Chile and Ecuador. That's the only ones so it's a whole different dynamic. I think in the north, especially because of the jungle, and the narco traffic, it's a whole different thing than the south. But here in the south, we had more wars between the borders. For example, for a period of time, Uruguay belongs to Brazil. So I grew up hearing that the biggest army that we have are here in the south, because these are the countries that actually went to war because of land. We had a huge war against Paraguay, which is a little bit in the north, more in the middle. And to this day, they said the Paraguay, one of the worst problems of Paraguay is the problem became from this war, because I think Brazil killed almost 95% of all male Paraguayan males, and the country, I think was 200 years ago, still didn't recover from that. And I grew up learning that Paraguay was going to be one of the biggest countries in terms of economic here when they were started to develop, and I think that was the reason why the war happened. But I mean, that was elementary school a long time ago. And one thing that I learned after I grew up, it's the history books doesn't usually tell the story how it actually happened.
Of course.
So there's a lot of, I don't want to say propaganda, but there's some things that we learned after that was nothing at all like it was in the history books.
It's a narrative.
Yes.
And, public schools in the United States in the 19th century, public schools, one of their primary purposes, and you can see this in any history book, was to Americanize folks because of the number of immigrants that came into the country. And so, yeah, you hit on a really interesting subject. If we talk about conflict along the border, if we talk about the border itself as a frontier area, then there were periods of lawlessness that existed that became part of the culture. And so the culture of smuggling, right, or drug trafficking, that's nothing new. And I think that's one of the perceptions that people have of the U.S.-Mexico border. Smuggling has been a part of borderlands since the colonial era, where you have Spain and France, and, they traded with each other illegally. I mean, that has happened.
Yes.
And it contributed to the construction of a culture that over the generations, over the decades, maybe even centuries, has remained. And so, when I spoke to the students, I said, if you want to further understand American policies towards the U.S.-Mexico border today, then it's important as a historian to examine the Jimmy Carter, President of the United States administration, Ronald Reagan administration, and then George Bush administration, because that was a period where you have an expansion of activities along the U.S.-Mexico border and expansion of military duties, where you have laws that permitted for the U.S. military to, quote unquote, police, to work with local police along the U.S.-Mexico border. And you have a budget expansion, massive budget expansion for the Department of Defense. I mean, if you look at the budget for the INS, which is just one branch, Immigration and Naturalization Service, it was upwards, if I remember correctly, of almost from 80 to 88 to $800 million a year, roughly. That's just for one branch. In the Bush administration, and there are several books out there that cover this data at length. But in the Bush administration, Reagan and Bush administrations, you have an expansion in patrols along the border, 89 to roughly 91. You go from 9, I believe, to almost 300 reconnaissance patrols. I mean, you name it. So that is a critical period that only to this day continues with, the military along the United States-Mexico border, an expansion in agents, INS, Border Patrol, you name it. And so, the construction of a wall, I mean, is that really new? No. What about the Great Wall in China? What was it there for?
Yeah, right? Or in Germany, in Berlin. Yeah.
Right, in Berlin. So, again, as a historian, if you want to understand policy along the U.S.-Mexico border today, then it really does. It makes a lot of sense to go back and look historically at how we constructed borders, and then the security issues that revolve around those borders, and that helps you understand how we develop.
I'm curious
those policies
to understand how life is between this border, because for one side you have all this tension, but the other side, like you said, there is this whole collaboration that cities that depend of each other. So
I like that question.
Yeah,
how is life? Yeah. Life is awesome. I say that as a borderlander because I grew up along the border. When I go to El Paso, I love it. I will say that my life has changed drastically since I went from that small town where I grew up pretty much poor. So now I went and played golf in El Paso, and I loved it, right? And I went and ate in local restaurants. It's great. And that's what I hope that people take away from this podcast, is that there's a lot of people like myself, thousands and thousands of people like myself, that are contributing citizens along the U.S.-Mexico border that love that place. I'm very proud of being a borderlander. And that, there are some differences, but there's, whether you're in Mexico or the United States, you're still a borderlander.
Yes.
And it's a culture that has grown along the U.S.-Mexico border. And, how far does the border culture go in? I don't know. That's a good question to debate. Is it 50 miles? Is it 75 miles? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, culture, I think it's basically almost the same place because you have all this exchange. But at the same time, you have a border, you have a place where you have to go through, and you have a process that you have. And I mean, I try to imagine how is that for people who live there every day, who have family maybe on the other side of the border, and how those tensions play in the everyday life.
From the people that I know, that I've lived with, that I grew up with, it wasn't necessarily there was tension because they have family on the other side. It was more of, hey, I'd like to go see my family, or they come to see me. It wasn't necessarily along those lines, or maybe I didn't understand. But it's, you grow up in a place and you become a part of that culture, and I guess that maybe is more like we talked about, an outsider's perspective as opposed to an insider's perspective, because borders are a real thing. It's an international boundary, right? And any country must protect its international boundary, right? And so, but those of us who live along the border understand those dynamics. And so whether we have family in Mexico or not, when you grow up on the border, you're part of that culture. It's a vibrant, beautiful culture.
Yeah, well, just imagine that, especially Brazil has a very different perspective from that, because if you look at Brazil and you look at the map, Brazil, I always like to say it's almost like a big island.
Really?
Yeah, because like 95% of population live across the coast, in the side of Atlantic Ocean. And the rest of Latin America is in the other side of the continent. It's in the Pacific.
Okay,
so there's not many people on the border. I mean, there's some cities that are there specifically to protect the border, to have people there. But the majority of population is not there. So the rest of the world, or either is other side of the ocean, or in the other side of the globe, on the other hemisphere. So it's very interesting, especially here in the south. I mean, Rio de Janeiro, you can see a lot of different foreign people that go there to tourism. But here we don't get contact with as many people from different countries. And especially every time that somebody foreign come here, it's almost like a celebrity. Oh, they exist. We are seeing one in person. We don't have that dynamic here. We don't have it. It's almost all of Brazil is like that. Okay. I know that in the border it's different. It's a whole different thing, but that's not where the Brazilian population is.
Okay.
So we are disconnected, geographically disconnected with all the countries in the world, and we have this little bubble, which we don't live that dynamic. I mean, we have developed a culture by ourselves because we have basically everybody from all over the world living here. I mean, the biggest Japanese population is here outside of Japan.
Sure.
But they live here. They are already here.
They're part of the mainstream culture.
Yeah, 2, 3, 4 generations already here.
Oh, wow.
So it's they understand Brazil better than understand the country they came from. So it's interesting to me when I see United States and when I went there. The immigrants usually are first generation or second generation, and the whole dynamic to try to integrate in the society. And this type of border, we don't have this here. That's why I keep asking about the tension.
I guess I'm going to have to visit the border here between Brazil and Uruguay and Paraguay. I'm going to have to go down there. Isn't that like 14 hours from here, though?
Oh, yeah.
That's a long drive. That's a long drive. Yeah, in the United States, are we not all the descendants of immigrants?
Yes.
Of course we are, right? And the reality is that immigration has been a constant part of our nation's history. And at any point in time, there were immigrants that came to the United States that were viewed as undesirable. All immigrant groups have gone through that process. And, to this day, immigration is a constant. It's part of our history. It has been a part of it, and it will continue to be a part of our history. And if you just look at those numbers that I told you about, today in Texas, 52% of the population are people of Mexican origin, or Hispanic, the majority of them people of Mexican origin. Mm-hmm. So that changes the dynamics of any region. And are there people like myself who are borderlanders who grow up in that region who are absolutely frustrated at some of the politics today? Of course, Of course, you can't deny that. Mm-hmm. That's very true. But that's where there's a popular adage: if you don't like what you see, you're going to go vote. Mm-hmm. Well, that's true. Go vote. And so it's incumbent upon us that if we don't like what we see, as Texans, as citizens of the United States, as borderlanders, then there's a process that, go vote.
What is that you want to show, especially here in Brazil, how our view from the border is different than what actually happened there?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, by looking at the people themselves who live along the U.S.-Mexico border, and those of us that are contributing citizens that love the borderlands, that, on some part there's frustration, but on the other part there's pride at the fact that, because the United States-Mexico border economically, you're talking, billions of dollars that legally, cross the border, right? The business that takes place, I guess I should say that's the best way to put it. And, there are people who are businessmen and businesswomen who operate along the U.S.-Mexico border legally that there's an economic dependence along the border between sister cities, but there's a lot of business that takes place along the U.S.-Mexico border. And since the late 1800s, the United States has traded with Mexico. There's free trade zones, North American Free Trade Agreement, which can be criticized because it displaced a lot of people in Mexico. That was in 1992. But it just gives you an idea on the amount of business that the United States does with Mexico. And so there's this region in between both countries that is called the United States-Mexico borderlands, where you have thousands and thousands of people, millions really, that live along, 90% of the people along the border live in urban centers.
And you want to construct this, this type of view that we have, that there's just tensions there, but no, it's just...
There's not just tension. Sure, there's tension, right? There's tension everywhere.
Yes.
But what I want people to see from my perspective is that there's a lot of great people that live along the U.S.-Mexico border that are contributing citizens that absolutely love the border, and I'm one of them. I'm very proud to be from the U.S.-Mexico border.
Coming back to the point that I was trying to make before is that that's very different from for us, that you have so many people live in the border. We do have a lot of business that we do with all the countries in South America, but we don't have that many people live in the border. We don't have this type of dynamic. We have people that live in border. We have cities in the border. But that's not where the population are. Right. So I think that's what is... I understand that people who are there, they are great, they get along, and it's a whole different thing. But what is very interesting to me, it's how life is in a place where you have that many people and you have all this political difference. You have one side, you have Mexico, where you have all these different laws and a way to see the other country, and the other side you have United States. We are dealing with a lot of different things, and immigration, it's one of the topics. Yeah. And I always come back like, what is the problem with United States economy and immigration? It's always one of the topics that's discussed.
Right, and that's what that's my message, is that don't overlook the people that live there.
Yes.
Who have an entirely different perspective, that don't see that as a dividing line.
Okay.
Because they've been there for centuries, decades, generations. And this is an area that they feel very comfortable in operating in. And that's a whole different perspective. It's a lot easier when you live in Caxias do Sul, because then you can say, I'm from Caxias do Sul, or I'm from Boston, or I'm from LA, instead of saying, hey, I'm from the border.
From the border.
Right?
Okay.
Then that brings up issues of identity.
Yes.
And, oh my gosh, the politics. And that's everyday life.
Yeah. That's I would say the main difference, because this feeling of belonging, and I belong to the border. I'm not just on this side or the other side.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
I'm a borderlander. I'm a fronterizo. I love it. Now, the citizenship, yes, I'm a U.S. citizen. Yes, all those things. But culturally, man, I'm a borderlander. I love it.
What is the difference between somebody who lives in the border and the rest of the United States? How do you define that? What makes this identity of people who lives in the border?
All the history that we've talked about, from colonialism through conflict, through policy, that's life on the border. That's who we are. We're a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial society that lives along the U.S.-Mexico border.
The rest of the United States also experience that, or do you see the
Maybe.
difference?
I think that whenever you have people visit the U.S.-Mexico border, if they spend enough time, I think that they start to realize that some of their preconceived notions may not be true. Because once you start to spend time in El Paso and you work in El Paso, then you start to see things from a different perspective. And that's important because any time that I've lived in different parts, in Mexico or wherever I've lived, I started to understand things from a different perspective once I spent time there. I really started to see things through the eyes of people who live in those cities or in those regions. And that's a beautiful process, because so you become culturally aware.
Yes. And usually that's something that we experience when we go to a different place, right?
Sure.
When we see... we give this foreign perspective, and we say, oh, people live here like this, and I thought it was like that. And I imagine, is this your first time here in Brazil, or
first time?
Yeah.
I'm loving it. Very nice people, by the way.
Oh, really?
Oh, I have met some wonderful people. Very friendly.
Yes.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. Usually, people like that's one of the first impressions that they have from Brazilians. Yeah. And that's a different thing when we go abroad. We always think people are kind of cold here.
I can see that.
Yeah. I had the experience to live a little bit in Canada. And I have my sister in Germany, and I go there sometimes. And it's very different. This whole heart whelming, like, oh, you are welcome, and I'm going to do everything for you to feel welcome in here. It's a bit different from, especially in these countries, I think. And I always hear, every time that a foreign person came here, I always hear that.
As a historian, I'm driving up here, and then I'm walking through the city, and I see some of the cultural presence of Italians and of the same thing, multicultural society. And as a historian, I'm thinking back on what I understand of processes, and it's unfolding for me as I'm here. And so the more time that I spend here, the more that I become familiar with that.
I think it's because, like I said before, we don't have that many foreign people here. Because we kind of live isolated, so every time we see somebody. But I mean, if you go to different families, that's the feeling. That's a culture that we develop here, welcoming people and try to make our best for them to feel good and feel welcome.
Very friendly people. Yeah,
that's nice to hear. I don't know if you have a preconceived image of Brazil, and you're not probably in a place where you thought, Brazil, I thought Brazil was like that.
No, when I was in graduate studies at the University of Arizona, there were Brazilian students there. Okay. So I had to take classes for my doctoral program in Portuguese, and they were taught by Brazilian students who also hosted a bate-papo so that we could familiarize ourselves with Brazilian Portuguese. And that was a very eye-opening experience for me. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but I came to understand that, and I already knew this, that until I actually set foot in Brazil, I wouldn't actually know those nuances.
Yes.
And so I can tell you that it has been an absolute delight being here. Yeah. I'm learning a lot. And I've got a ways to go before I can speak Portuguese. I'll tell you that. I have, I'm going to have to study and familiarize myself. But, Ultimately, we hope that students from Caxias do Sul, from UCS, will actually come to our university at Angelo State University. And so this is what I see as the beginning of a great relationship between both institutions, between the professors.
Yes, I hope so.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, we're getting to the end of this podcast.
Man, I thought we were just getting warmed up. I thought that this was we need to bring in some other people into this conversation.
Maybe next time, right, Fabiola? So if that's the start of a new partnership, let's do it again. So John, thank you very much for participating in this. It's very interesting. We, like I said before, we're starting this new program here, and we hope that we can reach different people, and it's always a pleasure to talk with people who study subject and talk about subject, and especially as
thank you. It has been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much for taking the time and allowing me to talk about something I'm very passionate about, and that's history and the border, and thank you.
Okay, for sure. Okay. Thank you, pessoal. Até o próximo episódio. Até mais. Tchau, tchau.